Good evening and welcome to St. Margaret's. My name is Bonnie Dowling. I am privileged to serve as the rector of this parish and to begin tonight with a word about this unique lecture series. The Slater-Maguire lectures were named for two couples, Ed and Allison Maguire, Jim and Barbara Slater, and their children, who had and continue to have a tremendous impact on the life of this parish. These two families have modeled a generous orthodoxy that is strong at the center and open at the margins, allowing the complexity and beauty of the world to inform their Christian faith, just as their commitment to the Christian tradition has enlivened their passion for people, craftsmanship, architecture, nature, poetry, and education. The Slater-Maguire lectures were conceived as, and have not failed to be, an opportunity to grapple with the intersection between the Christian faith and the wider culture of our time through deep intellectual engagement. Past lectures have included Stanley Hauerwas on mortality, the late Bill Blakey on the social gospel, Margaret Visser on the gift of thanks, Lauren Winner on religious metaphor, and Shad on fear. We are very glad that you have joined us this evening, and especially glad to have Mr. Phil Christman with us. But now, to give him a proper introduction, I'll call on Kurt Armstrong.
Oh, it's great to see so many people here this evening. If this is your very first time at a Slater-Maguire event, can I get you to raise your hand, please? Fantastic. I'm glad you're here, and I hope this isn't the last time that you're at one of these events. So, our speaker tonight is Phil Christman. His professional accomplishments are considerable. He's the author of 3 books, the latest of which was released about 3 weeks ago. The Times Literary Supplement calls Phil Christman one of America's greatest essayists, which I believe puts him in the company of people like Marilyn Robinson, Wendell Berry, Christian Wyman, Eula Biss, and Leslie Jameson. He publishes widely in print and online and on a wildly eclectic Substack called The Tourist. All fine and good, of course, and very impressive, but that's not actually why I invited Phil Christman here tonight. Now, I know for sure that some of you are not familiar with Phil Christman, and some of you are not that big on essays, so I've written my own brief essay called In Defense of Essays and Why I Invited Phil Christman to Come to Winnipeg. Webster's dictionary defines... I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. Totally kidding. I would not do that to you. For some of you, I can assume that the word essay is about as inspiring as the word colonoscopy. And some of you are already wondering if you've made a mistake in coming here tonight. I am sure that some of you have done your very best to stay away from essays since high school English class, when Mr. Dietrich told you that an essay has an opening paragraph with a clear thesis statement, a body of at least 3 paragraphs which support your thesis statement, and a final paragraph with a clear conclusion. And then that same Mr. Dietrich made you write essays about subjects you didn't care about at all, but you did your best anyways. And yet no matter how hard you tried, you never ever managed better than a B-. So at the end of grade 12, you decided that essays suck, or maybe you suck, or maybe just Mr. Dietrich sucks. Whatever the case, once high school was in the rearview mirror, you made a decision not to do essays anymore. Thank you very much. Or maybe it's just me. I want to encourage you that you have not made a mistake in coming here tonight to listen to an essayist, and here's why. An essay is nothing more than a literary attempt. An essay is a written attempt to describe, explore, play with, or discover the meaning of a thing, an experience, an event, a sense, or a feeling. And a good essay is a work of art. Essays can be very long or very short or anywhere in between, and they can be about absolutely anything. Some of my very favorite essays are about things like a solar eclipse, good versus bad cooking utensils, growing tobacco even if you're not a smoker, getting stuck in the desert, and trying and failing to hide the cataclysmic effects of a serious drinking problem. Now, good art resists summary. It is impossible to summarize a great song like Bruce Coburn's All the Diamonds. If you're going to do a great song properly, you have to sit and listen and allow it to take place in time. Likewise, a good poem. You cannot properly summarize a good poem. Summarizing poetry is like inviting friends to a dinner party, and rather than serving them something to eat, you hand out glossy photos of a great meal. It's a bad idea. Don't do it. Same thing goes for essays. Simone Weil said that attention is a form of prayer, and so if you're going to do a good essay properly, if you're going to read it well, you have to give it your attention. You have to give it time. You have to patiently allow the words to happen the way that notes happen in music, and you need to follow that essayist as he or she takes you through their attempt to do something with words. Phil Christman is an excellent essayist. He is masterful, playful, thoughtful on subjects like masculinity, geography, movies, books, and prank phone calls in the age of the smartphone. He can write about the very real policy implications of the words of Jesus without wagging a finger at his audience. He has a tremendous gift for telling people what he really thinks without talking down to us. He writes about punk rock and politics and resistance and virtue and hope. Phil Christman can build beautiful things with words that help build good things in the hearts of his readers. And he does it with joy and silliness and seriousness and anger, lament, humor, and self-deprecation. He is an artist. Now, I have always admired and envied and been intimidated by women and men with formidable intelligence. There was a time in my mid-20s when I worked at a daycare with preschoolers, and it was the only job I've ever had where I could say with some confidence I was the smartest guy in the room. I know a lot of very, very fine, very, very smart people, but I'm increasingly persuaded that prodigious intelligence isn't enough. Just last week, I heard a very smart man on a very smart podcast say, intelligence is overrated. Credentials are not that important. Being erudite and well-read in no way correlates with moral decency. We all know this sort of thing. People who seem to know everything make insufferable dinner guests. We need smart people, yes, but we also need people who can help us figure out how to live. People who can teach us about courage and hope and love. We need people of wisdom. When I read Phil Christman's essays, I read courage and hope and love and plenty of wit. He is very smart, but that's not why I asked him here tonight. I invited him to come to Winnipeg because I believe that Phil Christman is wise, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have him here. This concludes my essay about essays and Phil Christman. Took too long to get to the point. B-. Here to deliver our 2025 Slater-Maguire lecture entitled Haunted All the Way Down, would you please join me in welcoming Phil Christman.
Okay, well now anything that I say after that is gonna, I'm a band that just got upstaged by the opener. Like so hard. That was amazing. Just to preface a little bit, I'll say two things. One, this is an amazing thing that you have here. I'm not sure what all goes into this. My usage of the word "this" in the previous sentence, it definitely includes this lecture series and everything I've seen of St. Margaret's and the St. Margaret's community. and also all that I have seen of the city of Winnipeg. But y'all got a good thing going here. You should be very, very grateful for it. I mean, you are obviously being led by people with a vision. You should be grateful for the work that Kurt's doing, keeping this thing going. What a totally delightful man. Second of all, I chose the title "Haunted All the Way Down" because it fit better on the poster. We had a couple of other ideas we were kicking around, including "Disenchanted with Disenchantment." I think that was the first one, and then if I had known that I would be speaking to people who were familiar with the great film The Big Lebowski, I would have followed my initial instinct, which was to call this talk "Nothing is disenchanted here, dude." And that's why you should be courageous as a writer. You should do the thing you initially intended to do. That's what I should have called it. But instead it is "Haunted All the Way Down." And it is about my disenchantment with the sociological and journalistic concept of disenchantment. So I'll begin. Webster's dictionary defines disenchantment. Starting again. Every so often, you run across a piece of writing that really puts the vanity in Vanity Fair. Here is the opening of an article called "God Complex," which ran in that sometimes excellent magazine this past April. It's mid-October in San Francisco, and a crowd of 200 or so congregants, some seated in pews, others standing below cathedral windows at the back, bow their heads in prayer. Over cranberry apple cosmos and plates of Burmese food, served by black-shirted waiters, a DJ plays a thumping soundtrack of remixed worship music. This is not a church service or even a Bible study. It is instead an entirely new kind of event in Silicon Valley. We are here to listen in on a conversation between Dr. Francis S. Collins, the former director of the National Institutes of Health, and Gary Tan, the president and CEO of Y Combinator, which has hatched thousands of tech companies with a combined valuation of more than $600 billion. The event is called Code and Cosmos, and its underlying thesis is that the fields of science and technology, once considered diametrically opposed to religion and spirituality, might converge with the teachings of the Bible. In other words, business networking for the spiritually curious. This paragraph fascinates me. The author, Zoe Bernard, describes an event that is banal in at least 3 ways. 1, it sounds both expensive and lame, and thus exactly like most things in Silicon Valley. 2, it involves Francis Collins explaining that there's no law against being both a Christian and a scientist, as he has done, in no shade to Francis, in some way every few months for my entire adult life. 3, it is, as even the author Bernard recognizes, simply business networking for the spiritually curious, aka a type of event that happens in nearly every U.S. city where money moves around. The fusion of Christianity and business networking is not only not strange in a U.S. context, it's almost unavoidable. And yet she writes as though she just saw someone levitate. The implied reasons for her astonishment are themselves astonishing. She tells us that the event unites the fields of science and technology, which were once, considered diametrically opposed to religion and spirituality. Only in a universe where the Middle Ages had immediately been succeeded by a 600-year interregnum of circa 2009 Reddit-style atheism would these statements make any sense. Ah, Bernard might respond, but this is Silicon Valley, where, and again I quote from her story, for many years, the running joke popularized by the HBO show Silicon Valley was that in the Bay Area, Christianity was borderline illegal. This piqued my curiosity, so I went searching for evidence of this extraordinary unpopularity, starting with the article itself. How, beyond quoting old TV shows, did Bernard justify this extraordinary claim? She starts by demurring a little. Of course, there have always been Christians in Silicon Valley. They just knew better than to advertise their faith. This is to say, the Christians were effectively in hiding. Like communist Russia? Where did they hide? Did they meet in basements rather than churches? And one specific place they were hiding was, according to Tan, on a spreadsheet made up of Christians in tech, which was passed around for years among a dozen or so of the techno-faithful. Bernard lists some of these martyrs in waiting who passed this samizdat spreadsheet around. One of them was Trey Stevens, co-founder of the defense tech company Anduril and a partner at Founders Fund, the venture capital firm co-founded by Peter Thiel. Truly a life on the margins. So 2 thoughts here. 1, this doesn't sound like a desperate and embattled people encircled by hostile critics. This sounds like a rich and powerful person decided to keep a spreadsheet of his like-minded associates. The impression is reinforced by 2, the fact that we've been hearing about the Silicon Valley popularity of the Christian thinker René Girard for years now. Perhaps sensing that she has written herself into a corner, Bernard goes on. Part of the problem is that for most of Silicon Valley's existence, its overarching monoculture privileged a certain kind of smart person. It was the kind of smart person who campaigned for Barack Obama, marched for gay rights, and built a custom prayer stool to complement their priest fetish at the Folsom Street Fair. The subject of ethics, that is a good line, I gotta give it to her. The subject of ethics was brought up frequently, but almost exclusively in the context of their non-monogamous relationships. Black Lives Matter signs sprouted from their yards, and if they strayed beyond the strictures of atheism into spirituality, it was of the Eastern variety. I hate to break it to Zoe Bernard, but there were a lot of Christians who campaigned for Barack Obama, one of whom may even have been Barack Obama. There are still a lot of Christians who campaign for gay rights. And when I say Christians, I don't mean people who have a vestigial fondness for Christianity. I mean people who actually believe some or all of the Nicene Creed, or try to. Like, for example, the lesbian priest, Episcopal priest who saved my life when I was in my mid-20s. As for her implied contrast between people who sport Black Lives Matter signs and Christians, it implies one of 2 truly baffling possibilities. She either thinks that white people were leaders rather than sometimes awkwardly enthusiastic followers of that movement, or she thinks that Christianity is anything other than the dominant religion in American Black communities. I've known a couple of very frustrated Black atheists who could set her straight on the latter point. If I wanted to know whether Christianity were actually historically rare in Silicon Valley, Zoe Bernard was obviously going to be no help. So I Googled around. The Pew Research Center finds 46% of San Francisco metro area adults identifying as Christians, which is low for the US, but still a statistical plurality, greater than any other religion and greater than no religion, according to the same survey. I found an article from 2018 titled Silicon Valley's Surprising Business Booster, Faith. The author describes the fear and trepidation with which she came out as a Christian, the way she braced for backlash before admitting there hasn't been much. In 2016, BuzzFeed reports on Silicon Valley's hippest church. In 2015, the BBC reports on a surprising number of churches and temples in the valley. The same year, PBS devotes an entire episode of Religion and Ethics Newsweekly to finding God in Silicon Valley. I have so many other examples here, it actually gets kind of boring, so I'm just going to skip them. Again and again, the beleaguered Christians of Silicon Valley have emerged from their catacombs to talk to a journalist, only to discover, to their relief and astonishment, that they live in a hegemonically Christian light country. Light like L-I-T-E, like wimpy music on the radio. Bernard's article, however unusual in its shoddiness, is an example of a type of trend piece that has seen an uptick in the last several months. The intellectuals are rediscovering Christianity story. In a recent issue of Christianity Today, for example, Nathan Gee writes of a growing number of, and then he scare quotes this, intellectual Christians, people whose turn to faith is tethered far more to cognitive knowledge than to subjective experience. As an aside, I have never known what people are talking about when they invoke a dichotomy between cognitive knowledge and subjective experience, although I was constantly presented with and often threatened by this dichotomy for the entirety of my evangelical childhood. Real saving faith, the adults around me all agreed, came from subjective experience and not cognitive knowledge. Now, personally, when I cognitively know something, I experience that knowing subjectively, but perhaps that is a skill issue on my part. Gee cites the high-profile conversions of the historian Tom Holland, the writer A.N. Wilson, and the dissident Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Emma Camp, explaining how the elite changed its mind on Christianity for Reason magazine, points to the popularity of trad Catholicism, the sort of Catholicism that thinks it's too Catholic for its own pope, on the intellectual right. In a piece for The Conversation, Simon McCarthy-Jones surveys several thinkers who have extolled Christianity's benefits for social and moral cohesion, including Richard Dawkins, Jordan Peterson, and unbelievably, Elon Musk, as well as Hirsi Ali and Holland again. Last of all, writing for Barry Weiss's ironically named Free Press, the publication where you can say anything as long as it's not a boring cringe truth like Trump is a fascist or Israel is doing genocide in Gaza, Peter Savodnik instances the novel Paul Kingsnorth, the disgraced former comedian and accused multiple rapist Russell Brand, and the technologist Jordan Hall as examples of how intellectuals have found God. We hear again about Dawkins and Peterson, but Savodnik is most compelling when he examines people like Kingsnorth and again Hirsi Ali and her husband Niall Ferguson, who have actually converted. I was actually delighted in this particular piece to see St. Margaret's, where I'm giving this speech, credited with helping to inspire one prominent author toward an actual conversion experience. Good job, like seriously. It is probably good for my own soul to know that Niall Ferguson is a churchgoer now, because Ferguson, a self-confessed defender of imperialisms of several sorts, has spent his career worshiping power in the most disgraceful and undignified way, and I have very much disliked him for as long as I've been aware of his existence, and it's good for me to remember that Christ's heart is not frozen against my enemies, and that is good news for both me and for my enemies. I need Christ to go on forgiving sinners, whatever the inconvenience to myself. Savodnik, I will note, also refers us to a supposed Christian turn in Peter Thiel's thinking. I may be assuming more background knowledge, or background knowledge that is universal in the US and not everywhere. Peter Thiel is a major tech Trump supporter. He's rich because he was one of the people who bet big on PayPal working out and has spent the rest of his career on these incredibly creepy startup tech projects such as Palantir, which is a thing that helps the government spy on people. And he's really into the idea of rich people buying blood from poor people because it'll help with life extension. Literally vampiric. He's scary guy. So anyway, back to that. I do have to admit that the conversion of Peter Thiel would be God's greatest joke. Imagine the scene. One night, he's hunched over a spreadsheet trying to figure out how he's going to beat certain allegations, and all the René Girard he supposedly read hits him at once, and his heart flips like a canoe. Weirder things have happened, I guess. If Thiel starts giving large amounts of money to the people he has spent his whole public life denouncing as subhuman parasites, I will praise God for his immense charity to the least of us, and I will also praise God for having such a sense of humor. At the moment, Peter Thiel is going about the world giving lectures about how any attempt to regulate LLMs or artificial intelligence machines will risk bringing about the Antichrist, regulating them, not making them, and intellectually and financially sponsoring an administration that kidnaps Christian grandmothers off the streets and throws them in ICE detention. I am not the celebrity conversion quality control inspector, but I must say that the fruit of this tree stinks in my nostrils, at least. What is it about the intellectuals are rediscovering Christianity story as a genre that arouses my suspicions? Partly it's that such stories are almost always about something other than Christianity. I take it, of course, that the God roughly described by Christian theology and incarnated in Jesus is alive and can be relied upon to do all sorts of wild things, which include not only saving us from sin and death, but also, and I think this is understressed in our theology, not allowing humanity to destroy itself with nuclear weapons, even though they've been sitting on the mantelpiece like the Chekhovian gun, waiting to go off since 1945. I seriously think that's underrated as a like deductive argument for God's existence and God's goodness. It would not really surprise me to see our God reversing the demographic trend away from Christianity in the US and in other wealthy democracies, even in Europe. It wouldn't surprise me to see God convert my enemies or my friends or the intellectuals, however conceived. I hope for the salvation and renewal of all things. But trend pieces are the last place I would expect to find God's activity toward any of those ends. Usually what a Christianity is back trend piece means is that some rich people think they see a percentage in God. With a few heartening exceptions, that's what we're seeing here. For example, in the Zoe Bernard piece that I started out with, one of her subjects gives workshops about Christianity and innovation, and how basic venture investing principles are an exemplar of divine forgiveness. More particularly, these types of stories sometimes focus on Christianity's possibilities as a sort of political noble lie. I do not like to see sacred truth treated that way. Christianity nearly always becomes its own worst self when it allows itself to be used as the fiction that holds society together and keeps the rabble in line. A religion is true or it isn't, and if it isn't, the idea of wanting other people to believe an untrue thing just so that we can all rub along together a little more gently feels fundamentally insulting to everyone. It is not an attitude for adults. Nor is it fair to other religions to default to instrumentalizing Christianity in this way. Frankly, if I were auditioning religions solely based on the likelihood that they'd make us nicer and less selfish, I'd take a good look at Wicca, and I'd take an even better look at the Baha'i. Have you ever met a mean Baha'i? I have never met a mean Baha'i. They must exist. I've never met them. Various native spiritualities seem like they would do amazing things for the environment. I am only interested in a revival of Christianity because I happen to think that Jesus is God, and that acknowledging as much would at least save all of us a lot of precious time. It's also that over many years of scanning headlines, I've simply realized that there are certain story archetypes that the middlebrow US culture, for lack of a better label, is always telling itself. Other examples of these story archetypes include trash is the new high art, the Democrats must sell out harder than ever, did you know that there are non-canonical gospels where Jesus acts weird? It's time to tighten our belts and throw people out of work. Whatever happened to masculinity? Today's college students are annoying in a new and scary way. And finally, I found a new type of Nazi who's fancy. And Christianity is not just for dumb people anymore, is definitely one of those stories. And so I ask myself, why do we want to hear the story intellectuals rediscover Christianity over and over again from our journalism as though it were almost a bedtime story? What cultural values is it reinforcing? I think that, first of all, its very existence reassures us, despite the overt content of the story, that the coexistence of intellectual life and Christian faith is a problem that must be noted and explained, thus preserving us from the far better, but perhaps more destabilizing news, that it is a fairly common thing and needs no explanation, that faith requires the mind, that belief both sometimes strains our credulity and provides the necessary boundary, plausibility and what's the phrase I'm looking for? Plausibility structures within which logic must operate in order to reach any conclusions at all. I think these stories reassure the sort of readership that is so credulous before power and so slovenly in its intellectual habits that it is willing to take Peter Thiel or, God help us, Elon Musk as representatives of intellectual seriousness rather than representatives of money and luck. It reassures such readers that they are, despite their absurd credulity, in fact, wised up, enlightened, emancipated people who don't believe in bedtime stories. It allows us to congratulate ourselves on being good little disenchanted moderns. And while I accept the reality of God, the incarnation, angels, and resurrection, I have to say that I don't believe in disenchantment anymore. What do we mean when we speak of disenchantment? Why do journalists, cultural critics, pundits of various sorts, and academics often describe the modern world or the Western world as disenchanted? And what are we asking for when we call for its reenchantment? In both scholarly and journalistic usage, the concept turns out to be a rat's nest of competing and sometimes mutually exclusive definitions, not to mention in recent years demurrals of various sorts, including mine, to the effect that there is no such thing as disenchantment. On social media, the term can mean anything from "I hate LLMs" to "I wish my religious beliefs were never shadowed by doubt." Welcome to the human race, buddy. To "I think we need to re-enchant the world through fascist violence." If you force people to be specific about what they mean by the term, they will often tell you a story like this. Once upon a time, people believed that the cosmos was alive and sacred. The fairies spoke to us, and we heard them. Now we think the cosmos is a machine with no designer. The fairies have clammed up. We couldn't hear them if we wanted to. We struggle to believe in the supernatural, which has receded before the advances of science. And if we believe in God, we do so in a Dostoevskian, tortured by doubt way, or in a puckish, constantly doing a bit way, or at any rate in some wrong way. Of course, they're all the wrong way. We're sinners. We never believe perfectly. Our beliefs are never perfectly aligned with God, and we hope that God saves us anyway. Disenchantment, a word usually traced to the English translation of Max Weber's 1919 lecture, Science as a Vocation, is the name of the long process that got us here. So, for example, Richard Beck, a theologian and psychology professor at Abilene Christian University, writes that the pre-modern enchanted world was spooky, filled with occult forces, spirits, spells, superstitions, and things that go bump in the night. Ghosts, witches, demons, devils, and monsters. Our modern world, by contrast, especially in the West, is experienced as disenchanted. Due to the amazing advances in science and technology over the last 500 years, instead of a spooky, spirit-filled world, we've come to view the world mechanistically. The world isn't haunted, it's a machine. Christians struggling with disenchantment struggle to believe in heaven, hell, the soul, angels, demons, the devil, miracles, prayer, the supernatural stories in the Bible, like the resurrection, and God. If Beck accurately describes our modern world here, then we would certainly expect religion to seem incompatible with intellectual and especially scientific practice, such that the combination of these things would qualify as news. We would also expect the near extinction of belief in such things as, say, astrology, occult or esoteric practices, nature mysticism, sympathetic magic. But Beck's description is simply untenable. Beck himself has offered, I should say in the interests of fairness, much more nuanced descriptions elsewhere. My mom, for example, does not experience the modern world as disenchanted. She thinks the devil is right over there and that Christ is in her heart, which he certainly is. She honestly doesn't seem to experience that much religious doubt. Now, the theorists of disenchantment know how to handle this one. They've heard all about my mom, the fundamentalist, and your mom, the Catholic, and my friend who's into crystals, and your friend who does tarot. They know all about Oprah and The Secret and the horoscope that your newspaper runs or used to run until some conglomerate bought your local newspaper and shut it down and turned it into a website that aggregates AP stories with AI advertorials. Speaking of AI, they know about the downright kooky beliefs that many of our modern captains of industry suffer from regarding the agential qualities of large language models. They know about UFO cults and the Barnes & Noble witchcraft section. They've walked through the self-help section of airport bookstores, aka the place where men can get a version of The Secret that doesn't embarrass them. They know, in short, that belief in the supernatural has gone nowhere, whether among intellectuals or anyone else. Many of our theorists of disenchantment are themselves observant Christians, as Beck himself is, or adherents of other religions. Whatever their views, they're not stupid. They know that belief in the supernatural still exists. But they think there's been an epochal change in how we believe, although they don't all agree on the nature of that change. Thus, the conversation around disenchantment often turns a little comic, with both critics and defenders of the idea citing the same facts. Look at all this belief, says one side of the argument. Yes, exactly, says the other side. So, for example, in an interesting piece called The Colonialism of Disenchantment, Beck concedes the existence of hegemonically Muslim and Christian countries in the Middle East and Africa, and the explanatory power given to various forms of occultism throughout the global South. He knows very well that there are parts of the world where things still go bump in the night. He calls disenchantment largely a Western problem and concedes that the Christianity of the global East and South is very much enchanted. So we've narrowed the question of who lives in this disenchanted world. As Beck writes, it's educated white people in America and Europe. This is still not quite narrowing the picture enough for my taste. First of all, in my opinion, white is the name of a heterogeneous selection of once racialized, or at least distinct in other ways, people groups who got incoherently brought together for the sake of colonial divide and conquer in the Americas. They are not anything so well defined as a single culture or way of believing. White just means that while people may practice classism, sexism, heterosexism, and various other isms at you, they won't practice racism at you. It does not mean that you are a race, since races, unlike ethnicities, nationalities, shared histories of oppression, or tribal membership, isn't real. I'm a big fan of the Karen and Barbara Fields approach that says racism is the real thing, and race is the sort of like illusion that the practice of racism projects, right? So I simply don't think white names anything coherent enough to play a big explanatory role in who is and who isn't disenchanted. I honestly don't know whether for Beck, my mom would count as an educated white person in the West. She didn't go to college, but she was third in her high school graduating class in 1962. She has read more and better novels than the average male Zoomer college student probably will in his entire life. Is she educated? What about Africans who attend first world colleges, who read their Hume, who learn to take differentials or manipulate particle accelerators? What about Black American Protestants who believe in medical science and who with good reason suspect that the devil is busy? What about a white American engineering major at a secular school who goes to a Pentecostal or fundamentalist church? If you took those guys away, the whole academic wing of quote unquote creation science and intelligent design would collapse, as I think it richly deserves to. The actually existing landscape, and this is my point, of religious, philosophical, and spiritual belief is teeming. It's wholly different universes of belief that abut each other on every park bench or bus seat. And because it is modern belief, they abut each other while each of us is aware of the other universe in the head of the guy next to us. We diminish this teeming diversity by calling it disenchantment. But we'll wave aside for now the question of who is disenchanted and whether this condition admits of degrees. What does disenchantment consist in? What is a disenchanted person disenchanted of? Beck mentions 3 criteria: the absence of occult forces, spirit spells, superstitions, a mechanistic concept of the world, and a reluctance to believe in God, full stop. These are standard components of the idea. Writers on disenchantment in practice tend to focus on one of these more than the others. But these are also really distinct ideas. Because the God of monotheism has a nature, it is often enough belief in God, in such a God, that frees people to search for the world for causes that are less whimsical and more predictable, for example, than occult forces, spirits, spells, and superstitions. Nor does that search, which we call science, necessarily lead to a lifeless and robotic universe. Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, if any of you have read that book, she lives in a natural world that is very much alive and very much infused with the sacred, down to the smallest bits. And she's a scientist. She's a plant scientist, I believe. So we need to get a little more specific. What is disenchantment? In a brilliant essay called We Have Never Been Disenchanted, Eugene McCarrier tries to specify the relationship between the 3 components of disenchantment. Before the Protestant Reformation, he writes, the earth was suffused and enveloped by an invisible universe of spirits and deities who inhabited the natural world and could shape the course of human affairs. These spirits animated objects, dwelled in mountains or forests, delivered messages through dreams, oracles, and prophets. Whether they were capricious or governed by providential design, these forces could be mastered or entreated through practices of magic, divination, and prayer. The medieval church built a Christian enclave for these beings in its system of saints, holy places, and sacraments. But its Protestant and especially Calvinist antagonists, suspicious, in Max Weber's words, of magical and sacramental forces, commenced the demolition of the enchanted sanctuary. And with the victories of science, technology, and capitalism, we discovered that the cosmos of enchantment was unreal, or at best unverifiable. We cast most of the spirits into oblivion and made room for their withered but venerable survivors in our chambers of private belief. This is a more specific and thus far plausible picture, though I'm not sure how far McCarrier himself accepts it. So for him, disenchantment doesn't mean a general reluctance to accept the existence of the supernatural. It is rather a specifically Protestant tendency to ignore or deny the existence of the various intermediate types of influences and causes, wood sprites and the like, that carried on at every tier of the cathedral-like medieval cosmos. This does seem to be Max Weber's original intention behind using the word in his 1919 lecture, Science as a Vocation. The word he uses there means something like demagicking. The contrast is not necessarily at first between science and religion, but between science and magic specifically. But if this is disenchantment, then we have 3 problems. 1, Weberian disenchantment just sounds like yet another version of the story. Protestantism ruined everything. It sounds like a way of complaining that we can no longer be English peasants in the 14th century, a specifically Catholic cultural nostalgia framed in a way that even an agnostic like Max Weber can love. It's worth noting here that Weber was influenced by Friedrich Schiller's 1788 poem, The Gods of Greece, which laments the defeat of Greek paganism by Christianity as a way of allegorically complaining about the then ongoing seizure of Catholic lands by emerging German states. So, it's the Protestants' faults. As a Protestant myself, I'm just tired of this. I'm tired of framings that treat my faith as a declension from an older, fuller, realer faith and as something that exists only in reference to the Catholic Church. If I thought that were true, I would just go be Catholic. To understand my own faith in these terms seems a subtle form of faithlessness, a belief that God would be even more present to me had I only lived before the types of church that I have had my entire spiritual formation in existed. 2, we haven't answered the question of why demagicking would in itself lead either to atheism or to the belief in a dead mechanical universe. As many, many commentators on disenchantment have noted, Christianity itself has always been a disenchanting religion before it is an enchanting one. Cultured Romans accused the early Christians of atheism because we were not giving the right fealty to the previously sort of established gods. It might as well be as though we're saying there are no gods, nothing is sacred. Weber himself thought that the demagicking he spoke of was part of an incredibly long process that began at least as far back as the Hebrew prophets. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno link disenchantment to enlightenment in their classic study of the dialectic of enlightenment. But then they clarified that they don't mean the historical period, the Enlightenment, they mean the whole history of people figuring stuff out. If disenchantment is that old, I am not sure it's worth worrying about. You might as well lament having 2 hands or a nose. More to the point, if religion itself demagics the world, then why should it then immediately turn into a problem for religion itself? Yeah, okay. Never mind. 3, if disenchantment has to do with the separation of magic from science on the one hand and of magic from religion on the other, then I have really bad news. It seems that nobody whose job it is to know this type of stuff can actually tell you how or where magic is different from either religion or science. In fact, nobody's quite sure what any of these things are in themselves. One standard explanation is that magicians try to manipulate the world, which makes it a great deal like science. Right? And then science, on the other hand, we know very well from studies of how lab workers actually go about stuff. It relies hugely on intuition, on aesthetic categories, like this is a beautiful theorem, and so I prefer it to the ugly theorem. When all things being equal, you'll take the beautiful explanation over the ugly one. Science, even something there's that famous story about I think it's benzene, the structure of benzene being the guy figured it out in a dream. So, I mean, the boundaries between magic and science aren't clear, right? On the religion side, one standard explanation is that magicians and occultists are sort of they're trying to sort of bribe or force the transcendent, whereas religious people just accept God and have relationships with the sacred. And that's a kind of insulting description. There are certainly examples of people who are considered magicians or occultists who are trying to understand the transcendent, to conform themselves to what they believe it requires rather than to make it do their personal bidding, to manipulate it. And then, of course, there are certainly people we would call religious who constantly attempt to manipulate the world using dogma. So that distinction is hard to maintain. Jason Josephson Storm points out repeatedly in his book, The Myth of Disenchantment, that many of the scientists who worked to separate out what they did from what magicians did believed in the efficacy, if not the desirability, of magic. Newton is a classic example here. He was doing alchemy, which I I think like that's metal. I want to read a novel about that. But Francis Bacon, he's kind of seen as like ground zero for sort of like the intellectual the intellectual project of razoring everything sacred out of the world. Bacon actually wanted to sort of reform occult practice by separating it from demonism. Like Bacon was in our terms, a fully bought-in magician. And Bacon and Newton are not outliers or late survivals. Scientists, even scientists with highly reductive metaphysics, have gone on believing in God, ghosts, and vibes right up to the present moment. Einstein's belief in, he would call God the Old One, and his belief in the Old One is often cited as an example of a watered down and excessively modernized form of belief, but it still places him as far from Richard Dawkins-style scientism as any practicing Catholic is. Nor do many of the cultures, this is also from Josephson Storm, nor do many of the cultures in which what we call magic is practiced have a clearly worked out notion of the supernatural at all. To the extent that comparisons can be made, what they're doing is more like tinkering with a technology than it is like transcending the rational. Josephson Storm ultimately argues that magic simply functions as the buffer zone between religion and science, so that it means different things depending on the current state of negotiations between those two. Moreover, this is especially intriguing, Josephson Storm's account makes disenchantment itself intrinsic to the practice of whatever magic is. I have a long quote that I'll summarize. He quotes a bunch of examples of, like, if you read in the literature of the occult, going back like hundreds and hundreds of years, it always starts out with, there used to be fairies all through England, but then some crazy stuff happened. So now we have to recover fairy magic, like this or whatever it is, right? Or the things I'm about to reveal used to be generally known, but then something happened, and we have to bring them back. This has been going on like since way before modernity. Like this is an ancient rhetorical move in this type of literature. And he ultimately comes to the conclusion that in this respect, magic is constantly vanishing, even as magicians have claimed to recover it. Disenchantment is actually part of the trope of magic itself. There is no disenchantment. There is no enchantment without disenchantment. Well, so much for demagicking. This is one of several reasons why Josephson Storm describes disenchantment itself as a myth, a story we tell ourselves rather than a condition. Doug Sikkema, reviewing Josephson Storm for the New Atlantis, criticizes him by, in essence, agreeing with him. He says that basically Storm never fully appreciates the powerful ways in which myths operate, even untrue or questionable ones. That magic, religion, and superstition have all persisted, he says, doesn't mean that we have never been disenchanted. Basically, he says, because we have a myth that says we're disenchanted, that means we're really disenchanted. This sort of impasse is highly characteristic of the arguments surrounding the idea of disenchantment. Disenchantment is a myth, says Scholar A. No, man, you don't get it, says Scholar B. Disenchantment is a myth. Sometimes the conversation, as I tried to get my head around it for this talk, I found myself thinking of it as it's like some sort of Borgesian novel. The kind of thing that you have to buy from it's like kept in print by a small press somewhere. In this novel, all the elements of a crime story are present, but they refuse to stay put. The characters whose names keep changing all speak as though a death of some sort has occurred, but nobody agrees on the identity of the dead person, or where the body is currently located, or whether the dead person is in fact, at the present moment, truly dead. While some characters mourn their absent or dead friend, repeatedly conducting his or her funeral, other characters insist that the dead one has simply slipped away, Elvis-like, and is recuperating quite happily in Petaluma or Kalamazoo, or Saskatchewan or Jakarta. Our protagonists meet occasionally to report on the progress of this investigation, but these meetings invariably descend into raucous arguments amongst each other about who exactly is dead, whether they are truly dead, and also about the very meanings of such terms as death, survival, and crime. No one is dead, says one character. It's just that our friend James has left town for a while, and several other people have volunteered to take up his various social functions while he recuperates at a spa in San Juan. That is exactly the point, says another character. In the universe where James truly exists, no one can do James's jobs but James. We must resign ourselves to a Jamesless cosmos, even though I, personally, adhere to the belief that James exists, and I see him several times in a week. In fact, he is the most important person in my life. Yet another character asks, "Who is James? I thought we were talking about Sally." The second of our three components of disenchantment is the idea of the cosmos as mechanized. It is here that I have the most sympathy for the trope and its users. David Bentley Hart often invokes disenchantment as part of a sweeping critique of scientism and capitalism that I consider to be in its essentials basically prophetic. Forgive me for using that overused compliment. And yet the message that I ultimately draw from Hart's entire body of work is that the cosmos truly is not disenchanted. Reductionist theories of consciousness fail. Reductionist theories of language fail. Reason does not support the idea that animals are biological machines or that humans are self-deluded animals responding to an evolutionary programming. This is a story we tell ourselves, and it's one of our stupidest. And the reason that we keep telling it is that the most powerful people in the world want to keep treating the world like it isn't alive. Disenchantment thus turns out to be the name of a malign enchantment in which we all participate. When Hart is not lamenting the consequences of that malign enchantment, he is giving us, often with memorable wit, the arguments by which we can begin to undo it. In the same way that the Fields, that Karen and Barbara Fields, who I mentioned earlier, suggest that instead of speaking of race, we point out examples of racism. Because racism is a real thing. People do it pervasively, right? But race does not exist. I suggest that we speak of a disenchantmentism. The world is as magical as it always was, but somebody wants you to think that something happened, and it isn't. It is not clear to me, frankly, why a demagicked cosmos would become a godless one. But the connection between a mechanized cosmos and atheism does seem undeniable. Mechanizing the world means mechanizing ourselves. If we teach ourselves to look at animals and see Cartesian biological machines, it becomes easier to look at our own insides, our perverse but undeniable capacity for love, our curiosity, our desire to do things for their own sakes, and see a system jerry-rigged by stimuli and evolutionary pressure. Or rather, if we learn to misrecognize animals so fundamentally, because we have to in order to even live in a world that has factory farming in it at all, it then becomes easier to look past our own interiority and tell ourselves that we see just machine-like processes at work. To believe in a mechanized cosmos, we can't actually look within ourselves or at nature. We have to learn not to look at them, to look past them, to this grim and rather squalid fantasy. Having done so, we have cut ourselves off from the two most intimate and everyday sources of belief in God, in a world instinct with and aspiring to life rather than throwing it off by accident. I think the cosmos within and the cosmos of each other person and each other living being is like that is the closest to direct experience of like, oh yeah, God exists. That's like right there every day. Nothing about this kind of ignoring is scientific. It's scientism, the irrational application of reductivist methodologies, which can be useful for all kinds of reasons, to every phenomenon one encounters. The idea that God has disappeared under science's advance, that having dispensed with magic, science then turned to religion, simply won't wash. It's what Charles Taylor, y'all knew he would come up eventually, in A Secular Age calls a subtraction story, and it doesn't work as history of science nor as history of belief. Taylor shows repeated declines and revivals rather than a continuous dying out. Taylor narrows the problem helpfully. The nature and conditions of belief have changed, but belief remains robust. He writes, "The change I want to define and trace is one which takes us from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God to one in which faith, ... is one human possibility among others." That's Taylor. You can't really argue with this, or at least I can't. Indeed, I was going to say that I find huge portions of Taylor's A Secular Age convincing, but that phrase seems inadequate. Those of you who have read or tried to read A Secular Age know that it is almost an encyclopedia of modernity. It is as though Taylor wished to amalgamate every major topic within his subject area into a single vast megalopolis. Trying to refute him would be like trying to fight a city. In fact, I'm often struck as I read Taylor by how often he returns to the idea of cities and places in a book whose title suggests that we shall be dealing instead in eras. I think my metaphor about fighting a city is subconsciously influenced by his use of place language. And I think that a language of places can help us imagine and describe our situation more accurately than does a language of dis or re-enchantment. Taylor writes, for example, "One understanding of secularity is in terms of public spaces. These have been allegedly emptied of God or of any reference to ultimate reality." Taylor here, I think, overemphasizes just how emptied of God our public places have become. But to attack the problem from the other side, medieval trade networks were vast and medieval cities diverse. We have been finding ways to talk together from within very different metaphysical universes for a long time, probably far longer than civilization has existed. So the idea of a space that is secular, where we're kind of holding the things we can't all agree on in kind of a suspension while we work out who's going to pick up the trash, that's very old. Right? We have always made secular spaces together. If we find ourselves spending more time within them, if some people can imagine that they are even capable of living an entire life within them, is that not simply urbanization? If the secular is a space, something we walk into for specific neighborly purposes and then out of again, why act as though we are forced to live there all the time? If God allows us to make secular spaces together, is this proof of God's absence or weakness or non-existence, or proof precisely of God's humility, the same humility that God showed in creating beings capable of freedom and in becoming subject to the flesh? When we walk into a secular space, ought we not to praise God for that humility which allows us to learn how to pursue peace with our neighbors, rather than berating God for his absence? A city is not a disenchanted space. It is a space of many enchantments, good and bad. Though Taylor refers throughout his book to the concept of disenchantment, its place in his argument seems to me distinctly secondary. The condition he wishes to explain is secularism. I concede to Taylor that modernity is secular. When a modern person practices Christianity, they do so most likely in the knowledge that they could be something else. But enchantment, which he takes in the Weberian sense with some additional stipulations, that the small details of the daily seem linked symbolically to the cosmos, still operates. I'm sure Charles Taylor has heard all about TikTok witches. He's probably tired of colleagues forwarding articles about them to him by now. But the point is, enchantment, just like religion, magic, in other words, like religion, plods along just fine today. It just does so under the same conditions religion does. a person can live in a magical universe. They just know that their neighbor looks at the same universe and sees a void. To call such a social world, disenchantment or disenchanted simply concedes too much. Most of all, it concedes a far richer picture of how our experience, an experience which I think Taylor in his totality kind of does justice to, of our experience of the cosmopolitan itself as enchanted precisely in its variety, and of secularity itself as nestled within God's own world and God's generosity to us. If Macarier in particular is right, in fact, it concedes everything. In his account, that we are disenchanted is itself a story that we tell ourselves in order to naturalize living under the control of billionaires. However much as we've seen, okay, it's been an hour, so I'm skipping some stuff. Disenchantment is a story that we tell ourselves in order to naturalize living under billionaires' thumbs. It is an enchantment in its own right. Just as Christianity either exposed the Roman pantheon as unreal or at least as defeated, the myth of some inescapable modern disenchantment empties out the world so that it can be seen again in the light of a new and very dark God. It gives us a world where politics is no longer human, and precisely because human, plural, secular, but instead is dominated by godlike economic and cultural forces that we had just better catch up to. It gives us a world where what remains of the forests isn't worth saying because the true forests vanished half a millennium ago. It's a world where love is not possible because we are simply too denuded inside. Disenchantment is a way of telling ourselves that the depredations of the rich make sense, that the world is being rationally run by the sorts of scientists and technologists and politicians and thought leaders who hung out on Jeffrey Epstein's island. But these people are not rational. The kingdoms they build are flimsy, and even they do not want to live in them. And that is not how a rational person builds. Nor is it in their power, still less in ours, to disenchant anything in a way that matters. It is only in our power to destroy and ignore. The true God is as alive as ever. Seek God in your neighbor, even if you must walk through the secular heart of your city to do it. Seek God in the hungry, the naked, and the imprisoned. God is literally right there.
A+. I dare any of you to try to summarize that essay. I told you couldn't do it. We are going to move on to some time for questions, but first I would like to ask the ushers to come forward with the plates so that you have a chance to give your support to these lectures. Unlike some of the more interesting lectures you may have heard of, not more interesting, other interesting lectures, the Slater-Maguire lectures are not funded by any kind of an endowment. Slater-Maguire lectures are named after the Slaters and the Maguires to honor and celebrate the intellectual and spiritual inheritance received from them. But the ongoing work of these lectures depends on the generous support of the people who attend them. We could not do this without you. If you would like to contribute to the ongoing work of these lectures, I would invite you and encourage you to give generously. If e-transfers are your preference, there is an email address in your bulletin. You can also put your donation into the plates that are being passed around. $5, $10, any gift of $20 or more is a tax receivable donation. And as you try to decide how many zeros to add to the end of that check, I'm going to ask Phil to come back up to the lectern for a question and answer time. There's a microphone at the back for you if you have a question. I'm going to remind you of the two basic rules of the question and answer period. One, state your question in the form of a question. And number two, refrain from delivering your own Slater-Maguire lecture. Dr. Reynolds.
I think your message is disenchantment is a myth. Is that correct?
Yeah.
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 So I want to ask you, how does that fit with the myth of progress, which is something that we're all sucked into? So the myth of disenchantment and the myth of progress, are they related?
Oh yeah, totally. And that's that's a thing I wanted to talk about in the lecture, and then I read more of A Secular Age and by Taylor, and I was like, oh darn it, he said it better than I could. But he makes a really interesting argument about basically he says that there is a religio-ethical appeal to the idea of, like, the very narrative of, like, I'd love to be religious or spiritual in some way, but I just can't because science has proven that that's all wrong, and I can't just be a child believing in fairy tales, right? He points out that, like, there's never been that doesn't make sense as science, like, the whole Darwin disproved the Bible thing, like, none of that washes, right? You analyze any version of that argument, it never quite washes. And so what he says is we should notice the ethical and moral and indeed sort of stoic religious content of that appeal. It's, it's the idea that, like, that there's some sort of like a species-wide, like, childhood to adulthood process that is operating all the time, and that the abandonment of religion in favor of science, which, like, just think about what a crazy phrase that is. It's like saying, the abandonment of dishwashing in favor of record collecting. It's like the abandonment of thing that does one job with thing that does other, in some ways overlapping, but mostly not job, But he thinks it's that inspiring picture of like being part of humanity's maturing out of childishness. Like, that is all the real content of that idea. So yeah, they're completely, like, myth of progress and myth of disenchantment, completely linked. Yeah.
Thanks. So I have two questions that are kind of linked. To go back to the beginning of your talk, I'm curious about what you think about the historical origins of the intellectuals or rediscovering Christianity fun story that we retell ourselves over and over. I mean, was that running in papers in the 60s, the 80s, 2000? And so what does that say about our moment, I guess? And then also, I'm wondering if, the disenchantment story has something to do with people who are prominent in the discourse, who are either converts or reverts. I mean, I'm sure you can think of some of those folks who are, can't get over the feeling that they're always doing a bit, right? And that they kind of long for that Charles Taylor or Eamon Duffy, where everyone is a Christian and everyone does the saints' days and follows the calendar, because they can't really, feel it all the time in their daily life, if you see what I mean, because they know the context. Yeah.
Those are great questions. For the first one, I mean, I definitely feel like I've been seeing versions of Christianity. It's not just for stupid people anymore. I feel like that's not, like, I definitely see little trendlets of that for as long as I've been paying attention to the discourse, which is a bad habit that I should break. And when I was kind of reading around for this talk, I noticed, for example, like there's that famous Time magazine cover story about the death of God, God is dead or whatever. Apparently that was followed up within like just a handful of years by, wait, no. It turns out like maybe God's not dead. And look at this fancy person who became a Christian. So yeah, I mean, if I turn this into a book or something, I should like try to find like the smoking gun, what was the first one of these trend pieces? I definitely feel like you wouldn't be seeing that before sometime after, like, I feel like the Victorian period is when the idea I was just talking about in response to the doctor's question that we must accept that science has disproved that God and love and whatever exists. I feel like that's when that story kind of got established, and when it received its most inspired poetic presentations in the writings of like people like Matthew Arnold. Like you read the poem like Dover Beach, and you're like, he makes being an agnostic sound like this just mythic, beautiful thing, and it's the emotional content of that attracts people to that vision, is what Taylor argues, and I agree. So like I feel like it would be sometime after that generation that you would start hearing that stuff. But yeah, I mean, geez, that's probably the next giant rabbit hole for me to go into. And then on your second question, I mean, I don't know how much the discourse is driven by converts, but I definitely think it's driven by people who just feel bad about being Christians and modernity and kind of what I talked about at one point in the talk, feel like mad at themselves for the extent to which, like, yeah, you do have to will it sometimes. Sometimes you do feel like you are doing a bit, I think people need to understand that is of the nature of belief, that probably even in Eamon Duffy, peasant Christianity, everybody believes times, there were people who were like, I don't know if I'm really feeling the second Shepherd's play this year, I feel like the true meaning of the York Christmas pageant has been lost. Like there had to be versions of that feeling. They didn't have a larger vision to attach themselves to, so they don't become a big part of how people tell themselves the story of their lives. But those feelings had to always be there. And that's just in the nature of believing anything over a period of time. Like sometimes it's like a marriage. It's like, I'm not feeling it today, but this is who I am, this is what I do. And if I hang around long enough, I will remember why I believe in this. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thanks a lot, I really enjoyed that. So I'm kind of wondering if there's a sense in which, whether you would think that there's a sense in which the language of enchantment and disenchantment is almost a kind of like displacement of another language of like the sacred and the profane, or the sacred and the secular. Because I think there's a sense in which, like, when we talk about enchantment or disenchantment, you linked it to magic, which obviously you sort of was saying, you can connect that to science and manipulating the world. But with the sacred and the secular, we're talking about something else, where there's a sense in which the sacred is that which, has been set apart or sacrificed or is not under the realm of utility, or, whereas the profane is the thing that is, kind of subject to utility. So I'm just wondering if that language of like disenchantment and enchantment does some kind of like subtle displacement of another thing altogether. But anyway.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And I mean, thinking anthropologically about the sacred and the profane, yeah, if I wanted to turn this into a book, that would be like another thing I need to do. Right? I don't engage with that literature, and in particular, I use the word sacred throughout this paper in a sense that, like, is pretty perpendicular to like to the idea of sacred is set apart, profane is everyday. I use it in the sense, in a very like Christianized sense, where the sacred is the everyday, you know, and so yeah, I don't know how much those categories map onto each other, but I feel like that's definitely part of the conversation. And unfortunately, I just have to punt from there. But yeah, that's a good further direction, I think, to go with this.
Near the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned something about Saint Margaret or Saint Margaret's contributing to something, but I missed what you were referring to. So
Yeah.
Expand on
So if you, I mean, not that I want people to click on Barry Weiss's awful propaganda rag, but the Free Press story that I mentioned by Peter Savodnik, and I'm trying to remember the exact title, but if you Google around, you'll find it. Yeah, it mentions that a writer who was invited to speak, I think in this series, Matthew Crawford, he later converted, and he says that in the story he says that being here was part of his progress in that direction, which, you know, like, that's pretty cool.
Any other questions? Any other questions that you want to say into a microphone?
That's true. I'm here, you know, like, Gagger at Kurt's house.
Well, I need to just take a quick selfie with Phil and all of you. So
Yes.
we got to all say cheese. Wave and say cheese. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Cheese. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. It's been a joy to get to spend a few days hanging around with you. Thank you to this church and congregation for supporting these things. Thank you to the inimitable Jonathan Dick for his poster design. I got Jonathan to do one maybe 10 years ago, and I just ask him every year now. Thank you to Bonnie and Dawn for helping with the details for today. If you would like to buy a copy of Phil's latest book called Why Christians Should Be Leftists, there's a stack of books at the back. There's a jar you can make your own change. The books cost $35. If that seems like too much money, you blame President Tariff or whatever his name is. If you have not yet had your fill of Phil, I want to invite you to a reception at my house at 80 Furby Street. It's about a 10-minute walk that way. Here's something that I'm sure very few of you will remember. On this very day, 25 years ago, it snowed. Does anyone remember that? The only reason I remember is because today is my 25th wedding anniversary. Thank you. So if you want to come for some pizza and cookies with Phil and with the 25th anniversary couple, come on over to 80 Furby Street. 10-minute walk that way. One more thing before we go. May the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever he may send you. May he guide you through the wilderness, protect you through the storms. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Good night.